Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharat Kutun.
Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The cybersecurity of government entities is once again under the spotlight following news of yet another incident of Malaysians' personal identifiable information being openly sold on the internet for just a few ringgit. What is at stake and what have we learned with every leak? Joining us now is Jack S.M. Kee. She is a co-director at the Centre for Independent Journalism Malaysia, or CIJ. Jack, what red flags have the last few incidences of data leaks raised for you, particularly in terms of not just of how the government is responding, but also how the public is responding?
I think the biggest red flag is that despite several quite serious and major data leaks, there is still no discernible action that we can see. No, there is still no recourse. You're kind of just supposed to sit there and go like, oh, what do we do now? And then face the repercussions of it in your reality and in your experience. It doesn't feel as though this very heavily empowered ministry or commission has any capacity to do anything. I think that's the biggest red flag, that there's no shift in the kinds of responses that we're looking for to either increase our engagement with data privacy and data security as a conversation or as a practice, or to be able to strengthen our capacity to be able to respond to it, whether through investigation or through, greater securitizing of our data, or holding somebody accountable. There's no accountability even. I think even at that point, you're like, okay, how now? Yeah.
So, how now, Jack? I mean, what is it? I mean, I was assuming that the people who are tasked with, protecting or at least having oversight and providing the regulatory framework are aware of issues. Is it that the kinds of leaks that we're seeing are of rather mundane level or not a high alert? I mean, it's not DEFCON 4 or 5. I can't remember how the numbers go up or down. But, is there a way of calibrating leaks? And is it because these leaks have not been so serious that we don't see the action, or is it just incompetence?
Sharat, how can it not be serious? It's basically a leak that involves our identity card number, your legal name, your address, your mobile number, your race, your religion, and then tied to other kinds of data that is also using this as a very anchoring point. It basically means that I think the previous leak was people born between 1950 and 1992, and the current leak is now breaching that, right? Like between 1982 to 2000, early 2000. It basically means that every single person can be pinpointed based on your actual name, how to contact you, where you're actually located. And through that, I can also put you into other kinds of databases to find out, for example, what's your credit rating? What have you applied for? What's your other kinds of phone number? Where are you moving to? And with My Sejahtera, what do you like to eat? How often do you go out? Etc. etc. So it's extremely serious. It is the most serious. It is the most sensitive form of personally identifiable information of us that is available out there. There's nothing else. This is the most, In fact, if you don't have this number, you're not even Malaysian, right? Like, this is the only thing that's kind of basically saying you've got rights as a citizen.
I'm sort of intrigued by the headlines that also noted that this information was being sold for just a few ringgit. I mean, if it was so vital and important and could be used for nefarious purposes, why is it going for so cheap?
It's not being sold once. This is a data set that can be sold again and again and again. It's not cheap. It's 0.2 Bitcoin that can be sold again and again and again.
No, so help us understand. I mean, who would buy such information, and what are the likely? Is it people who just want to bombard you with, promotional material, or can it be
scam and spam. Mm.
That's one likelihood, and that's also not minimal, right? Like, think about it. In this 1 month, yourself, how many phone calls have you received? Just you. Actually, a question to everybody, right? Just this 1 month. How many phone calls have you received from a phone number that you did not recognize, who seem to know your name, who seem to know where you stay, who has some sort of information about you, that's trying to sell you something or ask you whether it's a lifestyle thing or whether it's like, hey, do you want to sell your property? Or hey, do you want to join this blah, blah, blah? It's not
I'm right.
nothing.
I agree. I think just thinking back on my own personal experience, I've gotten quite a number, if not calls, at least text messages from random numbers asking me if I want to work with an multi-level marketing or work from home, earn more money. But that's definitely an experience that I've had this past few months. I want to ask you then about the reaction, because you talked about the no accountability, and I think that's so important. But where can the accountability come from if not also with public outrage? And when often we talk about data privacy and data protection, it seems like it's not a very sexy topic for the public. There seems to be, people are aware of the importance of it, but yet it's not a very emotive subject for many. Can we talk a little bit about the public attitudes towards data breaches of personal information? You say it's so important and it's a very concerning situation, but I don't see that reflected in our public attitudes towards it.
Even the failure of public outrage is an accountability issue, because the Privacy and the Data Protection Commissioner, that's their job. The law has been in place for a long time, and it was only starting to be enforced, I think, in 2017. And all the period between then and 2017, what they were supposed to do is to build up public education and public awareness about how important data privacy is to you. And we are talking about accountability from an ecosystem perspective, right? You have the legislative, who's supposed to provide you with the legal framework to safeguard your rights. And then you have the commissioner, which is set up to be able to investigate, enforce the law, create things like education. And then you have the sector industries, right? The finance, advertising, media, etc., who's also supposed to play a role because they're data process. They process data, they collect data, and they're also kind of engaging with data in a very material and in-person way. And then there's us, who's watching, Netflix documentary, or if we've got time, right? The world is shifting, and we are creating a technologically mediated infrastructure for us to live. During the pandemic, we saw this. It's literally impossible for you to go out and buy food if you A, don't have a smartphone, B, don't have MySejahtera. They make it more and more difficult for you to be able to simply exist if you don't have some kind of device where you can exchange data with different data points. So whose responsibility is it for us to be able to understand what this means to us? It's shared it's a collective, and sorry, I'm talking over you, but I'll just finish my point and then I'll make space. But A, it is a shared responsibility, but B, it's also unequal, right? There is a disparity here. As an individual, how am I supposed to be able to keep up with all of the different implications and vulnerabilities that I have no say, very little say, in subjecting myself to, just because I have to exist? Whose responsibility is it?
Yeah, Jack, you point out this really important asymmetry in the galloping away of technology, and the fact that certain stakeholders are determining for all of us how we, as you put it, simply exist, and we have the exhausting job of keeping up. I do want to ask you though, what are the likely scenarios? Are we looking at somebody or some persons stealing data, selling it? Is there somebody in a trench coat, in a back alley saying, "Hey, I've got some data, I want to sell you"? And also on the side of the buyers, is there a responsibility to make sure that when they buy information, so because I've gotten phone calls from banks, banks buying data that is illegally obtained. I mean, how do you can you give us a sense of those scenarios?
it's not an individual, right? Like you're talking about large data sets. The person who's interfacing with you might be an individual whose job it is to basically make 30 phone calls based on the list that they were given and a script, and then try their best to get the one person who will then engage in it, and that one person is then worth. So just think about it as an entire industry. And parts of this industry is regulated and above ground, and parts of this industry is completely unregulated. And part of this industry is in gray zone and badly regulated. Like our PDPA itself is the weakest form of regulation you can think of. It was already pretty weak to begin with, and then in the last minute before it went through, it got weakened even more. So you're talking about things which are even things above ground already, which is very weakly protected, and then everything else sort of feeding into it. And that's the nature of big data. The nature of big data is that everything is parceled into categories in which then you can connect to other kinds of categories and parcel it again and then sell it off again. And at some moment, it becomes legit, right? It enters into that above ground area at some moment because you go, no, this is not the data that I bought from there. This is new data that I bought. And this level of data trading is completely legal. Legal. You can buy it. You can buy and trade data, and all companies do. This is Facebook's entire business model, right? That's kind of like, yeah, that's
Very
where
quickly,
we're
Jack,
at.
before we end, very quickly, what would you have us do? All Malaysians listening to this, what would you have us do?
Really push the government to strengthen our privacy safeguards. Governments should not be exempted from PDPA. They are the largest data collector and processor. If anybody's asking you for data, like really push for it. Like we need reform and we need reform now. Two, please don't share your IC number like it means nothing. It is the most important thing to you. Do not WhatsApp it. When people ask you for your IC number to sign up as a user for your customer service, it's not worth the 10% discount that you're getting. It's not worth it. Keep your private data like your most important thing. Really, they're using now, like, algorithmic decision making for sentencing. Like we are guinea pigs. We love technology and then we just test on Malaysians and then we see how it goes, but no safeguards. So really treat our privacy like one of the most important resources that we can have in our contemporary life.
Jack, thank you so much for sharing those insights. We really appreciate them. Jack SMK from the Centre of Independent Journalism, Malaysia. We're going to take a quick break here and consider this. We will be back with more. Stay tuned. Hi, thanks so much for staying with Shrad and I on Consider This. We're discussing the cybersecurity of government entities, which is once again in the spotlight following news of another incident of Malaysians' personal identifiable information being openly sold on the internet. Joining us now is Fong Chung Fook. He is the chairman of cybersecurity firm LGMS Berhad. Fong, can you help put this into context for us? Just how big is this data leak compared to the others? And also, how frequent is it? It feels like we're reading a lot more data breaches in the news, yet I'm not quite sure if anyone's tracking how many times a data set is leaked and sold on the internet.
I think data leak is not something strange to most Malaysian. We often see this kind of news being reported. Regarding the latest incident that what we have observed from the news media, it is something, is not surprisingly, it is something that we have know about it. I think for Malaysia, we have been suffering quite a number of major data leak, as most of us may have known. Since earlier 2014, we have a major telco data leak, and then following by that, the airlines have data leak, and until recently, the government agencies have another round of data leak. So I guess this is just part of our life. And what is more important, I think, from my perspective, is how are we going to deal with the leaked data that is going to, what kind of consequences it's going to cause us, and how are we going to deal with this kind of newer situation. And because leaked data can easily lead to many other consequences. Like for instance, fraud case. Nowadays, we see a lot more fraud cases happen. Many of these fraud cases are even very convincing, and many people fall prey. So
Yeah,
it
before we get
is.
into that, so before we get into that, because I think
Yeah.
the question of consequences is very important. People perhaps
Yeah.
don't understand, or the media downplays actually how serious these things are by not
Indeed.
spelling out the consequences. But before we get into that, can you help us understand? You mentioned a telco, you mentioned an airline, you mentioned a government as the source of these data breaches. What is happening there? Is there security architecture weak? Was it that they didn't invest in it? Or is it that the people trying to get in or penetrate their data systems are just getting more and more sophisticated?
Obviously, there are many reasons why data leak happen. So the first that usually surface is the weaknesses of the system that is holding the personal data. For instance, some of the servers is owned by the government agencies. Perhaps the lack of security protections, lack of security controls. Hence, data leak happen. There are other cases where data leak happen because of human policies and procedures. Insiders who are stealing information and then resell those information to a third parties, and these kind of incidents do exist. And to curb data leak, right, we have to look at it from a technical and non-technical perspective. Technical means that we have to deploy whatever protections that we can deploy, like firewalls, security protections. Non-technical means that we have to control from a policies perspective, the way how we access those data, the way how we control the data flow. So it is a complex issue by itself, but apparently, I think many of the organizations here, from private to public, we haven't really learned our lesson after so many rounds of data leak.
Yeah, that's precisely, I guess, the point of my next question is what lessons have we learned? What are we doing? How are we shifting the way we approach this? Despite, with every leak that happens, are we actually changing the way we're approaching cybersecurity? But on that note, also, I want to ask you, I mean, with any kind of security system, you can get the biggest, best, tightest security, but it's money, right? It costs a lot. So, are there? I guess are we just doing the bare minimum, particularly in terms of the government sector? Are we just doing the bare minimum to check the boxes of cybersecurity? Whereas, as Shurad pointed out, the attacks could be getting far more sophisticated. Is it a matter of cost?
Attacks are indeed getting more complex and sophisticated, but if you look at security from security perspectives, right, we have two ways of looking at things. One is preventive controls, another one is detective and corrective controls. Now, from a prevention perspective, obviously, I don't think we have been doing enough, whether from a private or public sectors. We really not doing enough. And even for the control of reactive, like let's say for instance, we detected that potentially there's a data leak, and if come and take a look at what recently happened. The government website, the government service was breached, and allegedly some data was happened to leak out from some of these government agencies. But we haven't heard anything from the government regarding their investigations, regarding the root cause analysis. We haven't heard anything. So that's why, from a reactive perspective, I think we are kind of lack off on that point. But
Yeah.
security is
So the question is, maybe they at present we don't have enough incentives, or rather disincentives, for corporations or even government to boost their security. Meaning, unless somebody takes action against government or airlines or any corporate entity for data breaches, they might just be complacent. They were like, okay, we'll explain this away and nobody's going to punish us for it. So is the way to incentivize serious responses is in fact punishing those entities that have been the source of data breaches?
Indeed, you bring out a very important point, being complacent. You see, the current PDPA that we have right now today does not apply to government agencies. So, meaning that if the government or any of the government employees are being careless or negligent or whatnot, that cause the data leak, there isn't anything that we can do against these kind of incidents. So, I think from a legislation perspective, we really need to look deep into the PDPA again and see how we can further fine tune the act and really uh, putting a more serious note on data protection, because to a lot of people, personal data doesn't sound like that there's a lot of importance there, but it is very important.
Right.
So
Well, thank you for bringing that up because I guess one of the things that perhaps is within the public domain is you think, oh well, I give out my phone number for everything I sign up for. My IC number is out there. My full name is out there. What is the big deal about this data being? Some might think that it's not a big deal, and complacency comes to mind as well. You alluded a little bit earlier to the dangers and the consequences of data leaks. Maybe you can educate us as to why it's so important to keep that private data, that personal identifiable information safe.
Well, personal data can lead one person to from one state to another state. For instance, criminal syndicates can use our personal data to create a very convincing fraud, and they can pretend to be authority tax agents and to call you, telling you that, oh, I have your IC number. I just want to confirm your home address and all this other information to make the entire scam so convincing, and with that they can also further fish out further financial information from you. So the most useful way these personal data are being used for are mainly on scams. And if not, we already been receiving so many spams from marketing agents, from agents from banks selling bank products, selling properties. That aside is another issue.
Yeah, so the idea now is, I think many of us, when we're confronted with these forms, think that we will not be able to avail ourselves of those services until we give this information up. And can we say no? Is my question.
Obviously, yes. In fact, if anyone calls you that claim to come from the authorities or claim to come from the banks or your credit card number, even the courthouse, whatnot, just hang up the phone and call the official number. And if you, in case you're worried that someone call you for, let's say, for instance, claiming to come from bank, tells you that your credit card has been cloned, just say thank you very much, hang up the phone, and call the bank. And in fact, we should just have the same practice. Anyone who calls us and it pretend to be or sounded like authority, you can just hang up and call back with the official number. You don't have to get worried about anything else.
Feng, you mentioned a bit earlier that PDPA does not apply to government agencies. I'm just wondering, is that the I guess the practice across the board in other countries as well? Are data protection, data privacy legislation almost always skewed just for the commercial sector as opposed to governments around the world? Is that, or are we unique in this?
This one I'm not sure because I'm not a legal expert, but what I can say is that PDPA and privacy are two different things. What we have over here in Malaysia, we only have personal data protection. We don't have a privacy law here in the country. So privacy also relates to many other matters as well.
Right. I know. Sorry, just a quick follow up. I know you say you're not a legal expert, but in terms of this industry, of the cybersecurity industry, and also as we think about technology and e-commerce and digitalization, is stricter legislation, is that the way forward? Will that also have some trade-offs with with fostering a more technologically advanced world?
No, absolutely. We need a more stricter policies, legislations to be fine-tuned because, as you said before, like when we move on to digitalizations, right, a lot more of our data are floating online. We are basically conducting business, conducting our lives online, and the only way we can identify each other is each other's personal information. So when we moving towards the maturity of digitalizations, right, I would expect, everyone to protect our own data in a more careful way. And I think that third parties like guardians who are custodians who are taking care of our data should face legal pressure and to be accountable, in handling our data.
So, Fong, just last question for you. I mean, you head a cybersecurity firm. Who is coming to you? Who is serious about securing the architecture of their data, and who is not? And where is the huge gap in the market at the moment in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, all I can say is that we serve organizations mainly from private sectors who are very concerned about their security from a prevention perspective. We also serve organizations who are in a way that need help during cyber attacks and digital forensic, where they have got hit and they need someone to help them to identify the root cause of identifying, knowing where the hackers are coming from, how did they get hit, and all that. So we seldom have any government engagements. So that's all I can say.
All right. Well, Feng, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. Cybersecurity consultant Feng Chung Fook there, wrapping up this episode of Consider This. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the evening.
Thank you so much for watching, and good night.